From my perspective, what I see is that Christians will say that certain ideas are Jewish. And I say, well, yes, they're Jewish, but that doesn't make them true. Jesus was a Jew, the apostles were Jews. So what? Just because they were Jews, it doesn't, like, that's one of their hooks that they try to dress up. The meta of Christian apologetics toward Jews is not, let's try to prove Jesus is the Messiah from the Tanakh. They can't do that. It's impossible if we use the Tanakh as the standard of evidence. They cannot do that. So their way of getting around that is when you do debates, if they have a rudimentary understanding of rabbinic texts, they will use that to try to undermine the idea of, and usually it's around the idea of the divinity, quote unquote, of, what they think the Messiah will be. And they'll quote, rabbinic texts out of context. They'll talk about the angel of the Lord, and they'll say the two powers in heaven, and they'll just embrace heretical ideas within Judaism and say, this is how Jews always were, and the rabbis were a reaction to that.
Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of Safer Ground. This is episode 3, and we have today Yehuda Yisrael on from the popular Counter-Missionary YouTube channel. Hey Yehuda.
Shalom Aleichem. Good to be here.
Really good to have you on, and really excited to see where we go with this one. We're at a really interesting time, Jewish festival right now, which we'll talk about later. And there's a huge interest in Judaism right now. Who would have thought that everyone suddenly is very interested in Jewish stuff, especially in the Christian world, given what's happened in the past? And it seems to be like overlapping and mutating into everything. And I thought it'd be great to have you on today because you yourself are a counter-missionary. I wonder if you could tell us, for the audience who don't know what that is, what a counter-missionary is?
Basically, when Christians come knocking on your door, asking you, why don't you believe in Jesus? You talk to them and explain to them why you don't, and then you give them reasons to not believe in Jesus, so much so that they will be walking away from you, as opposed to, I'm not interested. I believe what I believe, you believe what you believe, be gone, Christian. That's typically the way that Jews interact with Christians. Counter-missionaries actually try to flip the tables and say, actually, you're wrong. And let me explain to you why, using the Hebrew Bible, or the Old Testament as they call it, or we call it the Tanakh. And we use, the theology of the Tanakh. From my angle of being a counter-missionary is I use the Tanakh as the common ground, and I demonstrate why Jesus did not fulfill the messianic prophecies, and I, get Christians to agree, because where does the idea of the Messiah come from? The Tanakh, right? The New Testament is fully dependent on the authenticity of the Tanakh, but not the other way around, because the New Testament is making claims about the Jewish Messiah who is sourced in the Tanakh. They're false claims, but that's why the New Testament can't exist in a vacuum. It depends on the authenticity of the Tanakh, and that's why you can have this type of conversation with a Christian, because they supposedly believe in the same source material.
And so it's really spicy having you on today, because I think that although with respect to Christians, I think there's a misunderstanding on what Jews think about their scriptures given to them in their time and understood in their tradition, right? And a lot of the time they're not expecting a worthy alternative to some Christians, fundamentalists, interpretation of scripture. They've got a pre-planned set of, here's why it must be Jesus, you clearly don't understand. And then they're just like not expecting you to have something that they've never heard before, off the beaten path, as it were, right?
Yeah, I mean, most are familiar with Rabbi Tovia Singer. He's the most famous, but, Jews for Judaism, there's Rabbi Michael Skobek, there's Rabbi Yisrael Blumenthal. There's definitely counter-missionaries out there. My approach is more to be like, a lot of times on my channel, I will go on live streams where I'm the underdog, and I like to be able to show how to use live debate skills, where if you were in the wild and you encountered a Christian, you wouldn't really have to prepare a whole lot. You would have a formula to deal with how to get a Christian to understand, okay, you are dependent on the Tanakh to come to these conclusions, and if you're going to go outside of the realm of that, then you're not being faithful to the text and you're using, you're basically, as this is the most famous mashal or parable that we use to explain the way Christianity works is, there's a archer and he's, in the forest and he shot all these arrows and person's walking through the forest and he sees in the forest all these arrows are, there's a bullseye and everywhere in the forest he sees a bullseye, the arrow is right in the middle. So he says, he didn't see the archer make the shots, so he thinks he's an amazing marksman and he says, "How did you make all these shots right in the middle of the bullseye?" And he says, "Oh, simple. I just shot an arrow and painted the target around the arrow and a bullseye every time." And that is Christianity in a nutshell. That literally is it. They don't care about what the messianic prophecies actually say. They already assert their conclusion that Jesus is the Messiah, and then they try to paint the target around it to say, "Oh, look, he fulfilled this," and it's silly. So that's really what we're trying to exploit is that, that falsehood that they perpetuate.
I think Rabbi Tovia, as you mentioned, he advocates for learning Hebrew, right, as the big this will help. If you can read the Hebrew, you'll start to understand why Jews, if Christians see Jesus, as you're famous for saying, I see Jesus, it's an
Yeah,
eisegesis.
eisegesis, eisegesis. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
my kids actually watch your show and actually call it I see Jesus. And I was like, it's not actually I see Jesus, it's ISO Jesus, but I get you, right?
Right, right.
Yeah,
Yeah,
they
it's a
use this a
fun. Yeah,
lot and it's
it's
funny.
fun.
But once you see the Hebrew, sometimes you're like having to explain to a Christian, well, the Hebrew doesn't say that, but maybe the Greek Septuagint is a bit that says it that, but that's they start to see it's more complicated. It's not just that Jews can't see it, it's just that it's literally not written there. And if someone believes it's there, that's fine. That's a leap of faith, and you can have that, but at least understand why Jews don't.
Yeah, I mean, in my approach, I try to avoid, this is just my own shtick. It's great for Christians to know Hebrew, it's great for Jews to know Hebrew. The problem is that regardless of whether or not they know the Hebrew, there's always some scholar out there that's going to argue, like, for example, there's a famous argument that is used in Isaiah 53, which is the most famous prophecy that Christians like to use to try to prove Jesus is the Messiah by taking it out of context and saying that it only applies to the Messiah, when of course we know that, for example, in Isaiah 49:3, it says, "You are my servant Israel, in whom I will boast." And it says that this servant Israel will ultimately be a light to the nations. If you have a debate with a Christian about this, you will get them to concede 99% of the time. They will claim that that is the same servant as the servant of Isaiah 53. You don't even have to, it literally says the servant is Israel. So that's the end of the argument. But a lot of people don't like to use that because they want to, go through every single verse of Isaiah 53 to say why it's not Jesus. And the Christian likes to go through every single verse of Isaiah 53 and say why it is Jesus. That's the classic way of dealing with it. And what often happens is you get to this word lamo, which is understood by the counter-missionaries to refer to more than one person, but a plural word. The Christians will say that it can refer to one person. They basically hang their hat on that and they claim that that's a valid interpretation. All the Christian has to do is find one example in the Tanakh where the word lamo would be used to refer to a person. I think there's somewhere in Isaiah 44 where they say that it only refers to one person. So that's why I don't like to use the translational arguments as much, which is different. Tovia basically says, "I'm the authority on the Hebrew, therefore you trust me." The problem is the Christian doesn't trust the Jew, and the Jew doesn't trust the Christian. So a lot of times I will steel man Christian translations. That's what makes me unique as a counter missionary, I think, in this space, is I'll say, okay, fine, use the Septuagint. It still doesn't prove that Jesus is the Messiah. Use the Targum, and they pick and choose when they use the Targum and when they use the Septuagint and when they use the Masoretic. And it doesn't matter which which version they use, it still doesn't prove Jesus is the Messiah. So that's something unique about my approach that maybe other counter missionaries aren't as wanting to do. I understand why they don't, because the optics of it sometimes looks weird, but I think that it's more effective in a debate when you're trying to steel man or, show like even if I use your strongest argument, I can still prove that Jesus is not the Messiah, even if we use their translations and, follow what they want to say.
Yeah, it is unique. I've noticed that you do actually steel man the position. I think also I've heard Tovia saying that as well. He'll steel man in other ways. I know you mentioned the language, but yeah, of course,
Yeah.
like it does help. It's a very Jewish thing to do because you say, given that, then let's take it apart. You mentioned machloket and let's hash it out. It's a good way of doing it. But you
Yeah.
did mention Isaiah 53. I mean, there's going to be people clawing their eyes out listening to this, saying, how can you not see? And I think it's great that we've got you on because most people will never speak to you out of fear. I think because you will cause doubt, you will cause probably chaos to most people with a fundamentalist faith. But since everyone's in the Jewish realm now, I guess we have to be prepared for a difference of approach. What are the kind of usual ones that people come to you with on an average? They think it's such a strong argument, and you'll be like, well, what do you have to deal with regularly? The top verses, as it were.
I mean, one of my favorites is Zechariah 12:10, where it talks about like it says, I will pour out on the house of David and upon the inhabitants of Jerusalem a spirit of grace and supplications. And the next part of the verse is where there's a contention regarding translations. It's a machloket, a debate amongst Christians and Jews about what the proper translation should be. And so Christians will say, Thou shalt look to me whom they have pierced. And they claim that that refers to God being pierced, who they claim is Jesus. So the way that I get around that, and obviously the Jewish translation doesn't, hold in that way, but the Christian obviously doesn't trust my interpretation. So the way that I dealt with this in the past with Dr. Michael Brown and others is before we start discussing Zechariah 12, is I'll ask them, is the Messiah son of David a part of the house of David? They have to say yes, because that's literally the definition of what the Messiah is. A person of the house of David, a descendant of King David himself who will rule on the throne forever in the future messianic age. So if a Christian is looking at Zechariah 12, saying it's a future messianic prophecy, and then the verse starts out, I will pour upon the house of David and upon the inhabitants of Jerusalem a spirit of grace and supplications, and they already admitted that the house of David includes the Messiah, son of David, then when you read the verse, if you read it according to their translation, it says, I will pour upon the house of David, meaning the Messiah included in that, and the rest of the house of David, and upon the inhabitants of Jerusalem a spirit of grace and supplications. And they, meaning the house of David, including the Messiah, son of David, shall look to me because of who they pierced. So the Messiah, son of David, pierced himself? That's one of my favorite ways to counter that because the Christian doesn't trust the Jewish translation. The Jew doesn't trust the Christian translation. So contextually, we can see that the Christian translation doesn't make any sense because that's the way the house of David is defined, or the Messiah, son of David, rather. It's somebody through the house of David. So why would you all of a sudden decide, well, actually, the house of David isn't inclusive of the Messiah in this future messianic prophecy? Actually, it's separate from that. You see what I'm saying? And so that works in our favor when we approach it in that way, as opposed to let's dissect the Hebrew and then you just end up in a stalemate. This is the checkmate. And that's really what my approach aims to do, is to really force the Christian into a submission of like, I don't got anything. Like I have to agree with you.
Yeah, I hear the Jewish audience saying it's thrust through, not pierced, right? That's that word is very there's a lot of focus on it, right?
Right. I mean, obviously, there's different Jewish interpretations here, and the Christian will usually try to exploit the concept of Mashiach ben Yosef. I never bring it up, initially. It will inevitably be brought up later by the Christian. That's something different also in the way that I mean, not necessarily, like, I think Tovia also has this approach, but when Tovia hears a Christian bringing up rabbinic literature, he immediately says, you can't do that unless you accept all of it. That's not the way that I operate. I will instead say, look, you can bring it up, but if you bring it up, I'm going to use the New Testament against you now. I have a specific order in the way that I operate because I know that a Christian cannot prove that Jesus is the Messiah using the Tanakh alone. They cannot do it. So as a result, on my channel, I sort of created my own sort of meme where I say, but the rabbis, meaning that anytime a Christian loses a debate or is in a situation where they're forced to admit that they're using eisegesis, they will, as a desperation move, start talking about rabbis and take them out of context. So if I confronted a Christian on this, that was, someone in the know about rabbinic literature, inevitably they would say, but your rabbis say this is about Mashiach ben Yosef. And that's one opinion. There's other opinions that say it refers to multiple people being slaughtered in the battle, which, because it is a giant battle of, this is the famous battle of Gog and Magog, the famous battle right before the coming of Mashiach, which obviously hasn't happened yet. So once again, lends credibility to the fact that this isn't about Jesus being pierced 2,000 years ago. But aside from that glaring obvious point, there is an interpretation that exists that refers to Mashiach ben Yosef, but you will not find any rabbinic commentaries that say that it refers to the Messiah, son of David, which is consistent with, once again, that exegetical standard that the Messiah will be from the house of David. So all of it is consistent. That's another way that all of the arguments that I make, I do my due diligence, and I'm not contradicting things that rabbis say, right? That's what the Christian wants you to do. Their whole shtick now is to try to make you seem like your interpretations contradict scripture because you follow rabbis. That's what they're trying to undermine the credibility of rabbinic Judaism by doing that instead of trying to prove that Jesus is the Messiah according to the Tanakh.
Well, it's really interesting hearing your perspective on that. I don't know if anyone's ever heard you sharing your perspective because you're so busy locking horns on live streams and things with Christians and Messianic Jews, so-called. But it's really interesting because this is a completely different conversation we're having now, right? Than in the past, it would be it's obvious John 3:16, Isaiah 53, you're done, But now we're talking about, okay, once we get past the scripture references and we realize that's not enough, which is what you're saying, we then have to dip down into rabbinic sources, which we must discredit, but also simultaneously use to kind of fill in some gap. It seems like a kind of rabbit hole for New Testament believers to be going into, right? I mean, this is really uncharted territory, and easily you could get lost in there for sure, no?
Yeah, so you have to pinpoint which, you don't have to be a Talmud Chacham to be able to understand this because Christians always bring up the same like dozen prophecies every time. So you just have to, if you want to be, competent at being a counter missionary, you definitely need to read Perek Chalik at the end of Sanhedrin, right? Because they'll always bring up, things like Sanhedrin 98b. They'll bring up, ideas that, a lot of counter missionaries aren't comfortable steel manning. For example, the idea of a dying Messiah. I personally don't believe in the idea of a dying Messiah. However, the Talmud entertains the hypothetical possibility, and Christians will try to contextually abuse that, right? We don't know. The Messiah isn't here yet. That's really the only thing that we know that there isn't fulfillment of the messianic prophecies. But whether or not, somebody from the past would be resurrected, you could even argue King David himself if you take some of these messianic prophecies literally, where, like, for example, in Hosea 3, verses 4 and 5, where it says Israel will go many days without a king, without a sacrifice, without a ephod or teraphim, and then it says, afterwards the children of Israel will come trembling to the Lord their God and David their king, and come trembling to the Lord at the end of days. And this prophecy is my favorite messianic prophecy in the entirety of the Tanakh because it sets the timeline of the Messiah and it makes it very clear a distinction between the Lord their God and David their king, who all of the rabbis, by the way, recognize as the Messiah, son of David, and no one else, as opposed to a prophecy like Isaiah 53, where, yes, that is a prophecy that includes the Messiah, because Israel includes the Messiah, but it is not exclusive to the Messiah. And it shouldn't be any surprise to somebody who's using careful exegesis and understanding the servant is never referred to as a king or of David in the entirety of the servant songs. So that should be telling as an exegetical criterion as to why the rabbis are unanimous on Hosea 3:5 when it refers to David their king at the end of days ruling, and have different opinions regarding Isaiah 53, which all compose Israel, the Messiah, Jeremiah, Isaiah, Ezekiel. All of that fits because it's all Israel, right? Or the righteous remnant at the very least. I don't like to argue against the idea of a generic messianic application to prophecies because Christians will exploit dual meanings. So instead of saying, like being a gatekeeper and saying, you don't understand rabbinic literature, you don't understand the difference between Midrash Haggadah and Midrash Haggadah, they don't care about that. Imagine yourself in a conversation with a Christian and you say, you believe in three gods, right? This is, the Trinity thing. And then the Christian says, no, I don't believe in three gods. I believe in one God and three persons. Your brain shuts off as a rabbinic Jew. You do not care what that means. And your brain, it is avodah zarah. It doesn't matter. Well, that's how they feel. When you say, well, you don't understand what midrash is. They don't care about that. They just want to find a little nugget of information that matches what they want. Because remember, they are painting the target around the arrow. They are just looking for anything they can do to contextually abuse to fit what they want Jesus to be. And if it says something about, the possibility of Isaiah 53 having a messianic application, that's all they care about. And they will exclude anything else that undermines that, even if it's true.
Really interesting. And when you're talking about the people who your interlocutors are, who you're debating, are we talking here about Christians? Or are we talking about people who are Jewish of heritage who have become Christians, so-called messianic, if you like?
It depends, like, because you'd be surprised. Sometimes I make jokes and I say, I learned more, rabbinic literature from Christians than I did from Jews. That's not entirely true, but you learn some you would be surprised as how much, they could be Gentile Christians, they could be Jews that converted to Christianity, and then they knew, Dr. Michael Brown, for example, he made a living off of, distorting the context of rabbinic literature. So that's where a lot of these ideas come from. The thing is, like, this isn't practical halacha. This isn't stuff you're going to learn in yeshiva typically. You're not going to open up a midrash about the origins of Mashiach or, so much beyond usually what rabbis know. And it's frustrating for me because they only know a superficial understanding of it, is they read through Rambam's Hilchos Malachim, and they'll just say something like, well, the Rambam says Mashiach can't be killed. Great, but where do you find the source for that in the Tanakh? The Christian, once again, their brain shuts off. It's like if we were, hearing them say that it's not three gods, it's one God and three persons. We don't care. Like, we already know that that's avodah zarah. Worshipping Jesus is avodah zarah. It doesn't matter if it's packaged one in three or three. It's the same thing. It's avodah zarah at the end of the day. So, yeah, this just gives us more, where's the source of this material? Where's the source that the third temple is going to be built in the future, which relates to Tisha B'Av, which is tonight, so, which is in the Tanakh.
Underneath all of this, there's this kind of desperation to peel away the oral Torah from the Tanakh so that there's a way in. There's a way to kind of paste over it and to detach the Jewishness of Jesus, whatever the sudden interest. I don't really know where it started, but it seems to be an explosion. And we can't have a rabbinic Judaism being legitimate, right? It has to be totally detached, but at the same time, is that realistic? I mean, do you see that what's going on here? That we'll use these sources, but we really don't respect them because we don't believe in rabbinic Judaism. We want the faith of Jesus, which is some sort of proto-Christian thing, Is that what's going on here? And how dependent is oral Torah in the Tanakh? Surely it's inseparable for you.
Yeah, they can't really get around it, especially, and this also relates to when I say the word replacement theology, I mean that in a sense that Christianity itself tries to replace Jews on some level. Some of them say, well, it's dual covenants, whatever. I don't want to get into all the, dispensationalist, whatever stuff. But like at the end of the day, they're saying that Jews aren't really Jews unless they accept Jesus. The majority of people will say that. That's why you have the Revelation 2:9 and 3:9. Like, they're not really Jews. Like, even if we had an ethnic, if we could prove, which, a lot of us, we have Kohanim and Levim and that sort of thing. But like, even if they had 100% proof that we were descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that they accepted, they would say, well, you don't believe in Jesus, so you lost your covenant. You're cut off from the branch, which is not from the Tanakh, right? Whether or not you're from Israel has nothing to do with whether or not you believe in Jesus, right? That's sort of their oral tradition in a sense, or the Trinity, you could argue, is their oral tradition, right? Because it's not really explicitly in there. But for us, yeah, it's absolutely intrinsically linked to the Tanakh. I mean, you can look at the festival of Purim, right? The book of Esther. That's something in the Tanakh, a prophetic book that says the Jews will keep Purim for all generations. That's not something that is explicitly written in the five books of Moses, but that is something that is prophetically understood. Now, you could argue it relates to Amalek because of Haman and remembering Amalek. So great. It says these days of Purim will not cease from our memory. So you can technically, even link that back to the written Torah to remember what Amalek did to you. That's a part of, the only group of people that I know of that have kept Purim, in any real tangible, cohesive fashion throughout the past 2,000 years are rabbinic Jews. And there's even a verse in the book of Esther that says, I believe it's in Esther chapter 9, where it says that the fasts and their cry. And that relates to our understanding of Tisha B'Av today. Because during the Babylonian exile, which was the 70-year exile without a temple, did the Jews need Jesus' blood in order to gain a certain level of being right with God during that time? Or did they pray 3 times a day facing Jerusalem like Daniel did in the face of being thrown into a lion's den? God saved him despite this. But where does it say explicitly in the Torah that you're supposed to pray 3 times a day facing Jerusalem? Yet in Daniel chapter 6, that's exactly why he was thrown into the lion's den and God saved him. Why was he saved? If this was just a tradition of men that Daniel didn't need to do for any particular reason, that he just wanted, it flies in the face of Christians wanting to say, well, actually, you rabbis made up stuff that isn't in the Bible, and it was just a reaction to Christianity. The other way around, no. We already had a system put in place. If you read Leviticus chapter 26, it says what you do during times of exile. It doesn't say believe Jesus as your Lord and Savior. Rather, it says confess your sin and humble your heart, and then you will be brought back to the land. And that's why the generation after Daniel was able to do that and rebuild the temple. And now we're following that exact formula that Daniel did to rebuild, or however the temple comes about, whether it's built by hand or if it comes from heaven, however it happens. And we know that this is going to happen because tonight is Tisha B'Av, and it says in Zechariah chapter 8, verse 19, so said the Lord of hosts, the fast of the 4th month, the fast of the 5th month, that's Tisha B'Av, fast of the 7th month, and the fast of the 10th month shall be for the house of Judah, for joy and happiness, for happy holidays, but love, truth, and peace. The house of Judah again, right? That's the Jews. What church knows what the fast of Tammuz is? What church follows Tisha B'Av and fasts as millions of Jews across the world are going to do and have done for the past 2,000 years? What church knows what the fast of Gedalia is or cares to fast on that day? Or the fast of Tevet, the fast of the 10th? These are all fasts that are explicitly described in the Talmud, the Mishnah, and these fasts will turn into festivals of joy, meaning that, and you read the subsequent verses, so said the Lord of hosts, yet will be a time when that peoples and inhabitants of many cities shall come, and the inhabitants shall say to one another, let us go and pray before the Lord to entreat the Lord of hosts, I will go too. And many peoples and powerful nations, it says goyim, literally, it says, shall come to entreat the Lord of hosts in Jerusalem and pray before the Lord. This is not a bad word. This is literally the word for nations in the Bible. And it says, so said the Lord of hosts, in those days, when 10 men of all the languages of the nations, the Goyim, shall take hold of the skirt of a Jewish man, Ish Yehudi, saying, let us go with you, for we have heard that God is with you. If I bring this up to a Christian, they will often say, well, that was Paul and his apostles, or that was Jesus, or this is the church. How can it be the church, or Paul and his apostles, or Jesus? For one thing, the New Testament never quotes from this passage. It never quotes Zechariah chapter 8, verse 19. It never quotes Zechariah chapter 8, verse 23. If this is about Jesus, like, why are they not mentioning something so clearly messianic in nature? Because he didn't fulfill it. That's why. And we know why these festivals, or rather fast days, right? I think you called it a festival. I made the same mistake. I'll ask you a question. Why will we be celebrating these fast days as festivals of joy in the future?
Maybe you could give me the answer.
The third temple will be standing. All of those fasts regard the destruction of the temple. Tisha B'Av especially, right? But the fast of Tammuz, the fast of, Gedaliah was concerning when, Gedaliah was set up as the governor and then he was killed, after the destruction. All of this is related to Gullus, to being in Gullus, right? The destruction of the temple, the fast of Tabit when the walls were breached in the first temple, fast of Tammuz, I believe, was the second temple when the walls were breached. These are all relating to the temple. We will be celebrating these fast days as festivals of joy. Tisha B'Av will not be a fast day, it will be a festival of joy because the third temple will be standing.
The way that you're describing all this is, I think it cuts the heart. I really wanted to talk to you about this tonight, in this talk, because what we're talking about here is strictly in the Jewish mind, the Jewish part of a Christian's Bible, right? I think it's caused more problems than good trying to be really overly interested in this stuff, because if you're a Christian, respectfully, is it not true that Paul absolutely makes it clear that this is no longer applicable? It's tidied up, it's tidied, it's done away, it's fulfilled, or what have you. As soon as you shift from that position, even slightly, you're into this whole web of complexity. Like, how does this tie in? How does this apply? Everything gets confusing, right? Because there's this whole thing now that, oh, well, it's not fulfilled. Jesus is the telos. He's actually not the end of the Torah. He is the fulfillment. He's the goal. He's the destination. And it becomes so confusing, right? If we shift from Paul.
Right, because Paul kind of made it, muddled, because his whole argument is saying that, like, no matter how hard you try, you can't fulfill the Torah. That's his whole shtick. So you need Jesus, right? And it's absurd because they will claim, well, you don't have a temple, so how do you deal with your sins? And like I said, Leviticus 26 gives us the formula to that. Paul has to ignore that entirely and say, no, we don't have a means of justification. We don't have a means of salvation. We don't have a means of, forgiveness. But Jesus was never prescribed in the Tanakh as the solution to dealing with sin, and the proof is in the pudding. Christians sin the same way Jews do. What Christians have is nothing unique. It's a spiritual placebo. The placebo effect is very powerful, and if you convince yourself that you're saved when there's nothing different about yourself in terms of how you relate to sin, you can believe anything. And that's basically what Paul was able to do, was manipulate the Gentiles primarily into recognizing, oh, I don't need the Torah. I just need to believe in Jesus and then I'm saved. From what? I don't really know, because you still sin. And then there's the fear-mongering aspect of it, which, if you don't believe this, then you're going to go to, there's that famous meme of, like, Jesus knocking on somebody's door and saying, like, I've come to save you. And he goes, save me from what? And he goes, to what I'm going to do to you if you don't come.
Right.
It's creating a problem that isn't really there. And that's really what Christianity creates. I'll add one thing to what I said regarding your previous question, though, because I think this is necessary. In Zechariah 14, it mentions that all the nations are going to come up and attack Jerusalem. And many Jews are going to, as we spoke about before, there's some interpretations that say that that would refer to Jews dying in battle, unfortunately, more than just Mashiach ben Yosef. And it says, it will come to pass that everyone left of the nations who came up against Jerusalem will go up from year to year to prostrate himself to the King, the Lord of hosts, and celebrate the festival of tabernacles. Obviously, this hasn't happened yet. And when we spoke about in Zechariah chapter 8, it says that the Gentiles will come to the Jews to learn that God is with you, the Jews. So it appears as though they are going to learn from us, the Jews, how to celebrate Sukkot. And it says if they don't celebrate Sukkot, they will not get rain in their respective lands. It says, whoever of the families of the earth that does not go up to Jerusalem to prostrate himself to the King, the Lord of hosts upon them, there shall not be rain in the lands that they live. And there's going to be a plague, it says. So even in the times of Mashiach, which hasn't happened yet, there's still going to be sort of like a Torah. Basically, the Torah is going to be given to the Gentiles on some level where they're going to have to comply with Sukkot. I don't know how that computes with Paul, because once again, this messianic prophecy is nowhere to be found in the New Testament, proving that Jesus didn't fulfill it. They can use the second coming cope, but if he did away with the laws of the Torah, then why would they be celebrating Sukkot and not getting rain for not complying with that and not going to Jerusalem if the Torah is not relevant anymore? Doesn't make any sense.
This is actually one of the main reasons why all this is happening. I want to bring in Gentiles who are adopting, flirting with the Torah, I call it. They think they're keeping it, but really it's an interest in it, or there's certain things that they've become enamored by. But I do think it's because the whole sola scriptura, scripture alone thing kind of made sense as long as it was around a very Christian culture doing a lot of the heavy lifting. But once we have moved away from that, the more fundamentalist sort of Protestant evangelical denominations, it's not so clear the foundations, right? And so things like defining marriage and defining sin, to be honest, when we can't rely on that tradition that they have in the mainstream church, it is a kind of free for all, and it's very hard to justify. And so you have to claw at something, and people find themselves dipping into Torah, and they say, well, hang on, well, we can ban this thing now because, yeah, we can get back to the commandments, right? This is the Jewishness of Jesus. He was a Jew, so we should be like Jews. And it starts this whole kind of really bad set of things, and you really have to turn the volume down on Paul to do it, right? And that seems to be when I've really pushed people, they've said, well, Paul, but you know, and it becomes narrower and narrower, and people are more fringe and fringe. Do you see any way that Torah and New Testament Pauline theology can ever work together, or is it just a cognitive dissonance going to explode the person's identity in the end?
There's always a kernel of truth in the things that are said, but because he says there's no way that anyone can do the Torah, therefore you need Jesus. I think it's true to say that, like, obviously we're in times of exile, we can't do sacrifices. That's fine. It doesn't mean that we need Jesus in order to, like, that's really the problem, is that he's saying that he has the right diagnosis, he has the wrong solution. He has the wrong, way of dealing with it, a way of healing sin. Okay, yeah, we live in exile today. So the solution to that should be follow the Torah like Daniel did, like Ezra did, like, the people who came back and rebuilt the temple did. They, were trying to put in an effort to follow the Torah. They weren't putting in an effort to believe that some guy died on a cross for them and shed his blood. That's really the core problem, is that he's emphasizing the idea that you need Jesus' blood to be shed in order to be saved, and you must believe in his supposed death and resurrection. But that is not what the Tanakh teaches. In fact, in Deuteronomy chapter 13, it says, even if a prophet or dreamer of dreams performs a miracle and it comes true, and then they say, let us worship other gods who you have not known, you are to reject that prophet because God is testing you. So the rabbinic Jews of Jesus' day, for the most part, passed that test. Paul and his followers did not, because if they indeed worship Jesus as the God of Israel, then the burden of proof is on the Christian to prove that Jesus was worshipped in the Tanakh. And there's no way to do that because there is nowhere in the Tanakh where Jesus was worshipped. So Christians come up with painting the target around the arrow. They say he was really the angel of the Lord the whole time. This is not explicitly mentioned in the New Testament. This is more of an oral tradition that has very specious support, but that is what they put everything on. The church fathers go into this in detail, and it becomes, I call it the great Jesus angel hunt, where suddenly, instead of looking for whether or not Jesus fulfilled messianic prophecies, the Christian shifts the argument to, well, every time there's an anonymous angel in the Tanakh, since Jesus supposedly claimed to be the God of Israel, we're going to use every single verse, that has an anonymous angel in it and say, well, actually, that was Jesus the whole time, which is on so many levels inconsistent, illogical, and it's, building something that has no foundation to it and just ignoring the fact that even if he made the claim, that doesn't prove that it would be true. And because Paul makes the argument that the resurrection is everything, that contradicts Deuteronomy 13. And that's why, no, the
Yeah.
resurrection actually doesn't matter. It could very well be a test. I don't believe the resurrection happened, but even if I steelman that once again, if you once it, like we said at the beginning, the New Testament is dependent on the theology of the Tanakh, not the other way around. So if the New Testament is making a claim that Jesus claimed to be God, even if he resurrected, it doesn't say in Deuteronomy 13, well, actually, if you resurrect, that, forget about what this says. It's not really a test because only God can resurrect the dead. And that means that if he resurrects the dead, that means that that person was really God the whole time, even if it doesn't explicitly say it in the Hebrew Bible. No, because we know that God can also resurrect people to eternal abhorrence. It says in Daniel chapter 12.
Yeah, and I think they shouldn't need to do any of this because, like, if you believe New Testament, it should be done. It's tidy, you believe and you're saved, right? It's people are sincere Christians, right? But there's something right now that's leading people and going, hang on, maybe wait a second, and they find themselves in this world. It's bizarre that their conclusion is to pretend to be Jews and to say, well, yeah, we've missed this. Like, of course, like we will take hold of the seat of 10 people will come and take hold of the seat of Jews. And yeah, the festivals will be done in the end of days. And we do want a third temple. It's not a church, it's a temple. It's not Jesus, it's Yeshua. And it starts off this, we should be Jewish. I'm thinking now to ask this question, but this is surely a terrible conclusion, right? I mean, what would you say to people who are mimicking Jewish life? They're wearing yarmulkes. Jesus would never have seen one of those, never mind a tallis. He would have worn something else. What do you say to people who are they do see a problem with respect to them, and the conclusion is to dress up and not even to convert Jews, but just themselves. They need to be Jewish in their mind. What would you say to that?
Find your local Orthodox rabbi and go through a conversion, and at the very least, disavow Jesus as God. Because if you're so drawn to this and you want to be able to follow the mitzvot and you want to be able to, that's one answer I would give. The other is if you can't let go of this avodah zarah, then yeah, you're cosplaying. You're going around not being genuine. You're walking in this, cognitive dissonance, liminal space of contradiction, and that's you're really just you're being a deceiver, and there's no real purpose in existing in that space aside from deceiving people. So kind of pick a lane, I would say.
Yeah, they seem shocked. By the way, I've been accused of being a gatekeeper when I've said to someone like, "You can't, you can't do that." They're like, "No, like it's theirs. It's for the taking." Like they're really like offended by this, and I'm like, I don't think you understand just how damaging it is for yourself and your kids, telling them that they're Jews and you've got tzitzit on them, and God forbid you take them for a, bris milah or whatever, because this is happening. This isn't a small thing. There's hundreds of thousands of people doing this. It really is a bad place for people to be in. Eventually, they're going to realize this isn't working, right? Like I really should have went through a conversion. It's going to be much harder down the road explaining this to a rabbi and saying like, it won't be the first time they've heard of it, right? They'll have met people like this they can't work within the Jewish framework because their model is purely Christian and deity of Christ. How do you fit those together? I don't know, but you would suggest that they go straight to because the rabbi would be welcoming, right? They could visit, they could see if they connect with that, not with this pseudo Jesus, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's also important that we know what signs to look for. I've been doing this for a long time, so I can usually tell by the language that Christian, people that are feigning, like they're making it seem like they're, Jewish or what, they'll use Christian language, like they'll say the word fruit a lot. I don't know.
Yeah.
That's one of them. You'll know them by their fruits, or they'll say, edify. I don't know. There's certain language that like you go to Shior and you hear a Rav speaking, Christian like, yeah, you have too much pride, like I don't know. We talk about these same concepts a lot of the time, but like we use more Hebrew words, like gaiva, like but like they won't know the words as well, and they'll just be talking about, salvation or it's so it's on both sides of it. I think we also need a responsibility in our own communities to be able to sniff it out and be familiar with it if it's becoming a problem as well. One of the things that we need to be careful of is sometimes we come down a little bit too harshly on these people. They are people because like you said, families are at stake here, and you want to, at the same time that people are masquerading in this way, you want to do it in a way where you call it out without being too overly aggressive. You don't want to do anything, harmful to them, in a way as well. You just want to be able to call out the lies without turning it into something where, because I've also seen the other side of that where sometimes people get a little bit too extreme in the way that they call it out. Yes, it's threatening. Yes, it's a Hilul Hashem. Like there's many different ways, but you don't want to compound onto that more. Just calling it out for what it is, I think, is enough.
If someone's going to remain Christian, like what does it look like as a good Jewish and Christian relationship, right? Like in the same town, I'm sure where you are, there's lots of different communities there, as there are with mine. What is an ideal one that's got no blending, no appropriation? People aren't converting either way. Like, what's a good scenario? What's the best case? We're not going to tell Christians they're wrong about everything. Christians shouldn't be telling us we need to convert. So, it's in a simple way. What do you think the ideal scenario is?
I mean, I grew up more Christian environment. I'm Jewish, all of my family are Jews, but like I grew up in an environment where I was less religious and I became religious later in life, but I had enough tools at my disposal to make, an informed decision, thank God. But in that environment, like I think now the environment has changed since when I was younger, where like, you'd look now in the past, you'd look at like an evangelical Christian trying to convert you, and you would be like, oh, this is, obviously the enemy of my faith. Now, with more of the anti-Jewish hate mongering going around with the Tucker Carlsons and the Candace Owens and the, all this, now I have like a different perspective a little bit because now, yes, of course, spiritually they're diametrically opposed, but even if they're trying to convert me, at least they acknowledge that the Jews are a genuine, group of people. They have a little bit more compassion in that end of things. And I think that that is obviously, it's not the best partnership in terms of the long term, but in the short term, you can at least recognize, okay, so, you can look at Zechariah chapter 12 and you recognize that all of the world is coming up against us. And, maybe we disagree about Zechariah 12:10, but at least we agree on Zechariah 12:1 through 9, like with an evangelical, dispensationalist Zionist Christian, we've got a lot in common with regards to the first 9 verses of that chapter, you know. So that's sort of a new perspective that I've been taking because in the past there was less value in it, but now, we like to be able to make a connection between Christians on what are our common ground. And so that's what I would say. Find as much common ground scripturally as you can.
I genuinely think that we can live side by side and seeing Judaism as an authentic expression, becoming more educated in how Jews see their own scripture as valid, and saying, okay, I don't agree, but I can see now why they don't think that and why I do, and maybe there's challenges both ways. It's just don't let that enthusiasm for Israel and Judaism make you go online and buy like messianic talits and kippas and start wearing those in services and doing Passover seders and things, right? It's not leading in a good direction.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's definitely mixing basar v'chalav, as we say, milk and meat. So, yeah,
Yeah.
you want to discourage it. Sometimes, ironically, though, like I said, you want to be sensitive to sometimes those people are right on the cusp of wanting to, embrace, Noachitism or becoming even religious. So I wouldn't, becoming Jewish, really. Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, it's a little case by case, but yeah, in general, I'd say definitely call it out for what it is, cosplay and disingenuous cultural appropriation.
A lot of time people do really feel connected. They just don't know what it is they feel connected to. We call it the Jewish soul, right? And Judaism, and if they just gave it a chance to attend some services, they realize maybe it's not the Judaism or Jewishness of Jesus or whatever that it's been attributed to by these leaders who are doing it. It's actually just their Jewish soul. Maybe it's just waiting there, right? But they just don't have the language or the model to express it and identify it.
Mhm.
I wondered if I could ask you one last question, because it's been great to have you on. And it was just, there's something that I just thought maybe you'd like to chew this over. I hear this a lot by these messianic rabbis who are not Jewish or rabbis, amazingly enough. So we should come up with another name for them, but they're quite prevalent. And one of the things that really gets them success with bringing Christians into this is show me in the New Testament where Jesus said he came to start a new religion called Christianity. And it's a ridiculous question because people just aren't expecting it. Because of course Jesus was a Jew, followers were probably Jews, and Paul apparently claims to be Pharisee of Pharisees. So there is this idea that okay, so how did we get there from there? But what would you say to that question? Like, show me literally in the New Testament, because this works so well on people, and they fall for it hook, line, and sinker, and they're queuing up to join. And I just think I would love to hear what your answer is as to finish, if you don't mind.
So just to make sure I understand, you're saying like they're arguing that it's the same religion as the continuous religion of the Jewish people.
They're arguing that what they're offering, which is a kind of weird rabbinic Judaism, but it's really Christianity dressed up,
Yeah,
is an actually decrypted form of Judaism from the New Testament, right? And it
right.
should be a Judaism, not Christianity. And so these Christians go, oh, he doesn't say he came to start a new religion called Christianity, so it must be a more Jewish
A
expression.
continuity, yeah, the continuity of it is the true expression, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a lot of, different opinions on this. Like, I don't really know what Jesus' initial intentions were. I don't know what the apostles actually believed. What I do know is that if you believe that Jesus is chas v'shalom God, you are committing avodah zarah. So if you are meeting with a messianic Jew who rejects the divinity of Jesus but wants to genuinely follow halacha, right? That might be an opportunity. That's why I'm not completely, I know this is a different take than usual, but like that person might actually be closer to converting to Judaism than you would expect. But if it's somebody who is convinced that Jesus is chas v'shalom, the God of the universe, right? Lahavdil, you're probably not going to have a lot of usually those types aren't really trying to follow the Torah sincerely. But every once in a while, you'll get a Christian, quote unquote, that's getting in a direction where they might genuinely be on the path to Judaism.
But yeah, so what we really want is to keep those sort of boundaries. And if someone does want to convert, they have to convert because it's impossible to be recognized as Jewish when you believe Jesus is God and you hold to the New Testament, right? There's just no way that they can be blended. And that's just a hard truth that people need to come to terms with. and they need to face that first, which you do when you speak to a rabbi, right? And that's what we're trying to
Right.
promote. But no, it's been absolutely brilliant, honestly, to have you on and to talk about some of these things and to hear your perspective from someone who's dealing with these hyper intense debates, super fast thinking environments, and to show that the Jewish people have their own way of understanding things, and that's okay, right? But you have to really
Yeah, for sure.
choose if you want to be a Christian or a Jew, and less of the blending. So, yeah, thank you so much. And yeah, I hope to have you on again soon.